Mixed martial arts is a very unforgiving game. Very few make it to the pinnacle, and even the brightest of stars don't typically shine for too long. Time and time again in this crazy sport, we've seen the cream of the crop and even legends suddenly fall from grace, especially being smacked in the face by harsh realities embodied by the fight game. Up next, we got Tony Ferguson. Ever since his impressive victory on season 13 of The Ultimate Fighter, Ferguson has been one of the most dynamic fighters in the sport. With his combination of knockout power, submission skills, and seemingly infinite cardio and unmatched durability, he tore through the UFC's lightweight division. He established an impressive 12-fight winning streak, which included an impressive win over rising contender Kevin Lee. So it all starts when the UFC offered Ferguson a short-notice replacement in Justin KG for UFC 249. Despite the heavy risks that came with this decision, Ferguson, as always, accepted the fight. Unfortunately, KG's improved striking was simply too much for Ferguson to handle, and KG eventually scored a standing TKO in the 5th round. With his 12-fight winning streak finally coming to an end, fans wondered how the former interim champion would rebound from the devastating setback. At UFC 256, Tony Ferguson sought to bounce back against the surging contender Charles Oliveira. However, despite Ferguson's reputation for submissions, Oliveira shocked the world and dominated Ferguson for 3 full rounds on the ground, at one point catching Ferguson in a nasty armbar that the veteran stubbornly refused to tap to. Unable to defend any Oliveira's takedowns, Ferguson lost a one-sided decision. Although many began to wonder if Tony's best years were behind him, some simply credited Oliveira for his improvements and held out hope for a miraculous title run for Tony Ferguson. It wasn't long until Tony Ferguson was back in the octagon with Michael Chandler. Ferguson returned after just 1 year away from competition and was slept for the first time in his professional career. Courtesy of a front kick to the jaw by the Iron Mike, the former UFC interim lightweight champion was out for several minutes, but soon regained consciousness and left the octagon on his own. The knockout was described as one of the most horrifying knockouts in UFC history. In January of 2019, Tyron Woodley was the UFC welterweight champion, coming off dominant wins against Darren Till, Damien Myers, Stephen Thompson, and Robbie Lawler. However, Tyron Woodley's world came crashing down at UFC 235 when he attempted to defend his title for the 5th time against surging contender Kamaru Usman. Tyron Woodley was unable to deal with the intense pressure and wrestling skills Usman brought to the fight, and was dominated in a 5-round unanimous decision loss. This loss to Usman essentially created a blueprint for Woodley's future opponents to follow. Both Gilbert Burns and Kobe Covington utilized a similar combination of relentless pressure and wrestling to continually dominate the former champ. The Burns fight ended up in another unanimous decision loss, while a broken rib saw Woodley pick up a 5th round TKO loss to Covington. Woodley was then matched up against Vicente Luque in the co-main event of 260. Woodley clearly realized that his opponent was capitalizing on his predictable tendencies inside the cage and came out with much more aggressive of a game plan. Despite having early success, Woodley's strategy ultimately backfired as Luque was able to stun Woodley. This ultimately led to Luque locking a Darce choke, leaving the former champ unconscious. Ben Askren made history. Unfortunately, it was the wrong kind, and he will be remembered for it. Askren was a victim to a flying knee from Jorge Masvidal at UFC 239 and was knocked out in 5 seconds, the fastest knockout in UFC history. That fight, as memorable as it was for fans, changed the trajectory of Askren's career. Today he's no longer with the UFC and is out of fighting altogether. Ben Askren entered UFC 239 as a hot commodity. The 2008 Olympic wrestler and 2-time NCAA champion featured an unblemished professional MMA record of 19-0, which included his most recent victory over former UFC welterweight champion Robbie Lawler. Before joining the UFC, Askren had been dominant in Bellator, where he earned his welterweight title belt in 2010 by defeating Lyman Good. He successfully defended his title 4 times through 2013. It was at that point Askren had hoped to get a chance to join the UFC, however, the call never came. Askren then went on to join One Championship in Singapore, where he replicated his success in Bellator from 2014 to 2017. Askren dominated the welterweight division, winning the title and defending it 4 times in 2018. In 2018, in an unprecedented move, the UFC traded Demetrius Johnson to One in exchange for Askren. Bad move. On his first fight into the UFC, he defeats Robbie Lawler in a very controversial win, and then goes on to fight Jorge Masvidal, where let's say it gets a little tricky. The finish was in literally just 5 seconds. Jorge Masvidal takes a few steps and lunges forward with his knee. Ben Askren bends over and the knee connects perfectly with his neck. Lights out. If there was a positive for Askren to take from the event, he has no recollection of the history-making moment. He went on to say, "There's a little part of memory that's blank. I remember being in a cage with him. I don't remember the flying knee." Good on him. While Ben Askren doesn't remember the actual moment, every day that followed, he was reminded of the moment through MMA media, social media, and anyone who follows MMA. And shortly after, Ben Askren then retires from MMA, making his announcement on the Ariel Helwani show in November the 18th of 2019. That about sums up the video. We got more shit coming out on Sidecontrol, so do not forget to subscribe and hit the like button, and just make sure to comment.